Okay, I was a little concerned there for a moment because Zoom was telling me that my internet connection was unstable. But it looks like we're good to go. All right, so before I jump into this, just one more check that you can, in fact, hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. All right, well, I'll go ahead and jump in and we'll get going here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Davis. I'm a botanist, and on this evening, I am wearing my ethnobotanist hat, and very excited to be here and to talk to one about a hobby, a lifestyle, and many other things that are really very, very important to me. Can you see me? There we go. So whenever I was a child, I was obsessed with taking care of myself. I grew up in a rural part of northern Miami-Dade County, and my mother purchased a lot of books on wild plants, on wildlife, and studied in order to have a regional mastery of these species, both the ones that were edible and medicinal, and also the ones that are just native, ecologically significant. So along the way, I learned how to take care of myself in the wilderness, what to eat, what not to eat. And so I'm really excited that this is sort of there's a renewed interest in this across the world, especially here in Florida. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and jump in and we'll get going. Okay. Okay. Did that work? Because it wasn't working for a moment. Did the slide change?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, sorry about all that. Okay, so before we jump in and start talking about ethnobotany and about plants, I want to make sure I share with anyone that's not aware of these maps, maps that are known as forage maps or known as field foraging classrooms. And I've worked to create a bunch of maps where anywhere that you are around the state, you can go to an area where a number, many species of plants that are both edible and or medicinal have been added to the map, where you can use your Google Maps on your phone and go in real time to these locations, learn about the plants, learn how to identify them. And so you can have that field component in addition to what you read and what you research and what you hear about this evening in this PowerPoint. So here are some that are in Central Florida. So if you want to learn about woodland species and wetland species, you can go to Spring Hammock Preserve, and I've added a number of points in there. You can also go to Central Winds Park. There's a number of points for different species in there. And then if anyone wants to go down to the garden, I've added a number of points in and around the perimeter of that. If you want to learn about some native species, some edible and medicinal exotic species that are popping up here and there. So if anyone is interested in playing around with this map so that they can run around and essentially plant cache, looking for these edible and medicinals, please email me, and I'll put my email address back up at the end for questions and or to send this map to you. So, and with that, we'll go on and jump in and take a look at some stuff. So ethnobotany, if we want to look at the actual academic language, is essentially just the study of the relationship between plants as it existed in the past, as it currently exists, and as it potentially will in the future. And so it's really a very interesting, fascinating subsection of botany. And there's a lot of people that around the world are ethnobotanists, and a lot of them may not even know that they're ethnobotanists. Let's say they work for a fragrance company and they're running around looking at aromatic compounds that whether they want to have the actual natural essential oils of, or they want to learn how to synthesize that compound. Well, that's ethnobotany. Looking at compounds and plants that work as medicine, that maybe can be synthesized in the pharmaceutical industry, ethnobotany. Looking for the next new big crop, ethnobotany. Running around and just collecting your own food, ethnobotany. So it's a really interesting sort of multidisciplinary subdiscipline of botany. So as you learn species in your neighborhood, along the roadside, in the woods, you kind of go through this metamorphosis, the psychological metamorphosis, where at once what looked like an overgrown roadside covered in plants that you knew nothing about other than that they looked weedy, you now see that they have a purpose. You now see that they often have a benefit to yourself. And you arrive at this realization that there really is no such a thing as a weed. And so it was a transformation for me as a young lad, and it's been a transformation for a lot of people to realize that these super edible and medicinal plants, often growing in cracks in the sidewalk on the side of the road, are super beneficial, so on and so forth. All right, so it is in fact a truth. Here in Florida, you do in fact live in a forager paradise. And there's a number of reasons why you live in a forager's paradise. And so among other reasons, Florida sits at the junction between some major climatological zones. So for example, in North Florida, we have continental North America that is sort of reaching its southern limit and intersecting with subtropical Florida. So you have a lot of northern species growing in the same ecosystems as southern species. And then in the southern half of Florida, you have some temperate and some subtropical species at their southern limits intersecting with a lot of true tropical species. So can you imagine what it would be like for someone who comes from somewhere like Canada and has not been to Florida before, and they see these ecosystems with maples and pines and an understory of tropical vegetation, including saw palmetto. It's very surreal. A lot of diversity here. So we have a lot of different ecoregions around the state where across deep time, these regions were isolated as rather an archipelago of islands when sea levels were higher, or because of where these places were positioned along the edges of rivers. They were refugium for plants that were escaping ice up north during the glacial maximum. And so just a lot of evolutionary variety in addition to the junctures between climates. And on top of that, Florida has a very long history of human interaction. So native peoples, and then lots of folks coming from all over the world have come here, and many plants have come with them both on purpose and incidentally. There are plants growing on the side of the road, outside of your home, your apartment complex, at the grocery store, that were hitchhikers on the boots of folks that were coming over here 500 years ago and have been here ever since. So huge diversity. So the primary reasons that I hear from people as to why they're interested in learning about foraging are these. So a lot of folks are looking to lower their budget and how much money they spend at the grocery store. And a lot of other people want less dependence on the government and don't want to pay additional fees or taxes for things that they harvest themselves. Perhaps you're learning about these plants because you're going on some sort of trip, the Florida Trail, any trail around the country, and you're wanting to pack light and forage for food along the way. Maybe you're just interested in this as a hobby. This is something that you do with your friends on the weekend. There's a lot of people that do that. Maybe you want to make money from wild plants. So there are a lot of plants in this state right now that are recommended as commercial crops by the government, and no one has cultivated them yet as such. Maybe you're an educator, you work in academia, you're looking to inspire minds to get involved and do this stuff, or maybe you just think this is a really weird subject, sounds kind of cool, and you want to be able to brag to people at parties that you can eat weeds in your backyard. Whatever the case may be, there's lots of reasons to forage. My reason for foraging is very straightforward. I just like eating. I get hungry everywhere that I go, so I like to be able to pull stuff out of the ground and nibble on this and nibble on that. So that's a little salad of all sorts of species that were growing wild in a backyard. It took me just a few minutes to pick that, and I was able to feed myself in a situation where I didn't have anything to eat for an hour or two. Right there. So, yep, I love eating. So in addition to all of these other reasons, it probably should be noted that you can uphold your civic duty, rather, here in Florida and everywhere around the world to control invasive plants by eating them. Many exotic, both exotic and invasive species in Florida are edible, if not downright nutritious and super good for you. So why not control them by collecting them and eating them? So we'll talk about a few of those. So to put into perspective for you just how high of a diversity of edible and medicinal plants exist in Florida and in areas around your home and really anywhere, here's a 1.7 mile running trail that I run and hike on. And it runs through a number of habitats, including heavily disturbed and intact ecosystems. So I went ahead one day and ran through here with my Garmin GPS to take points on everything that I saw that was edible and or medicinal, and then I mapped it. And so when I mapped it, this is what I saw. I saw approximately 77 species of plant growing along that along that trail side in 1.7 miles. And it's very eye-opening when you see all of those species and realize that essentially food and medicine is all around you. And all that's lacking is the knowledge as to how to identify it and or prepare it. But once you have that, if you really wanted to not buy food, if you didn't, if you wanted to live on your own and grow your own stuff or harvest your own stuff, if you really wanted to, you could. So that's a list of the species that I saw. Don't worry about keeping up with that small print. So before we get in and talk about some species that you're likely to see out there, let's go ahead and just go through a few little caveats and precautions. So first and foremost, this is an introduction. And so there are many, and by many, I mean many hundreds of edible and or medicinal plant species in the landscape around you. And so we can only go over a handful of them right now. So just keep a few things in mind whenever you're out there. You obviously don't want to be collecting material from a place that's been sprayed. And by sprayed, it's important to note, has it been sprayed with insecticide or has it been sprayed with herbicide? Things like herbicide, there's a lot of research, well, really a lot of research that goes in both directions, but the half-lives of a lot of chemical compounds that are used in herbicide generally sort of diffuse or break down and oxidize in the environment, and usually a few weeks to a few months. So if you see that an area has been sprayed, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily off limits forever. So there are a lot of hardcore foragers in the state of Florida that are heartbroken when they come to one of their favorite places and see that it's been nuked. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't harvest stuff from there again in the future. But it's still important to know, you don't want to harvest stuff that's been sprayed recently. So consume new material in moderation. So you're consuming if you consume plants, keep in mind that enzymes you have in your body are there as a result of the plants that you commonly eat from the grocery store and other foods that you purchase. And so it may take some time to develop some enzyme diversity, bacterial diversity that can process these things. So if you eat something that's super edible, but it makes you feel a little wheezy, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's making you sick because of that plant. It just might mean that it's a new food for you. Don't over harvest. We want to leave stuff for wildlife. We want to leave stuff for bees. We want to leave stuff for other people. So we don't want to be someone that goes out and just kind of removes everything. A lot of these plant species, you can go in and remove a lot, and they're generally unfazed. So luckily we have that going for us. And a lot of people mention that they have a hard time finding locations to forage. I personally, just through experience, have learned that it's generally a lot easier to find places than one might think. So don't feel that this is something that you can't do in whatever respective region you live in. And very importantly, ask as many questions as you can, and learn as you go. So whenever you're out there foraging, it's really important that you pay attention to detail. So on the left here with that red circle, that's a Category 1 invasive species. That's Ardisia crenata, so better known as coral ardisia. It's an invasive species that in its raw form out of the ground is not very good for you to eat, and you should not eat it. However, on the right is Simplocos tinctoria, better known as horse sugar, which is a super edible plant that you can eat the leaves off of, and kind of tastes like green apples. So just make sure you pay attention to what you're looking at. You see how in that red circle, the leaf margins are crenate, they're ribbed, versus the plant on the right there, the leaf margins are entire. Just some stuff to pay attention to. So in Florida, we have 4 primary types of foraging. We have plants that are often found in secondary ecosystems. So a place that's been clear cut, or a place where a hurricane or a tornado has come through, and or a place where we used to farm, or we grow pine trees. There's a lot of plant species that are associated with places like that, that are distinct to places like that. Then we have a whole menagerie of wetland species. Many wetland species are super edible, full of carbohydrates, calories, nutrition. So that's one of our 4 primary sources of plants. Ruderal, so places that are mowed a few times a year. We can have a huge amount of herbaceous diversity of herbs and flowers and wild greens. So ruderal places, that's really one of my favorite places to look for food, because the plants there tend to be vigorous because they're annuals. And so they grow and produce a lot of biomass really fast. And then our 4th type are intact ecosystems. So woodlands and all of the different natural communities that you're likely to see around the state of Florida. There are many species that you find almost exclusively in those intact ecosystems. So those are our 4 primary types. So for example, in Central Florida, this is a fallow orange grove. You can see some citrus growing there in the middle. And this area is kind of undergoing an ecological succession. So this would be a secondary habitat where you'd be likely to find a whole bunch of goodies in there. And then intact ecosystems are going to range in Central Florida and throughout the state, from flatwoods to cypress strands to coastal strand, all sorts of interesting things. Wetlands, as I mentioned, lots of goodies. We have duckweed and pickerel weed right there in that photograph, both of which are edible. Pretty good. And then my personal favorite are ruderal, kind of dystopian looking places where you have all sorts of delicious things to eat. So every plant, every herb that you see growing in that photograph is edible and really good. So you never know what's growing around you until you pay attention and learn. So plant seasonality. If you're looking at an empty lot by your house and you don't see anything, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing there. It just means that maybe you should come back every month, every few months, and take a look. A lot of the plants that we see in the state are only vegetative and above ground for a part of the year. Yes, we have a number of other plant species that are up year round, but many of them only produce an edible component part of the year. So in this photograph, for example, we see that there's an eastern prickly pear and there's also a passion vine. Both of them are flowering. So what that means is we would need to come back later on in the growing season in order to find ripe fruit on both of these species. So seasonality is super important. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in here and talk about some plant species that are very prevalent, if not ubiquitous, throughout peninsular Florida as well as the Panhandle, and we'll kind of go from there. So here is an old sort of trash site where bricks and concrete have been dumped around a tree, and that is a literal monoculture of oxalis, pinkwood sorrel growing on the left, and then that's a large monoculture of chickweed, stellaria, growing on the right. That is basically just a big salad growing on the ground right there. So we'll come back to these and talk about these plants. All right, so the mulberries. Virtually anywhere you go across the state of Florida, you're likely to encounter a mulberry. Mulberries often confuse people because some mulberries have leaves that don't have any lobes, whereas some will have lobes and others will have both unlobed and lobed leaves on the same tree. But at the end of the day, once you learn those little things, you know a mulberry anywhere and everywhere that you see one. And throughout the state of Florida, you can not go virtually anywhere without finding mulberry trees. And in the spring of the year, they can just be loaded with fruit that often fall off the tree onto a sidewalk in the road. And a lot of people don't know what they are. So all of that delicious fruit is just lost. And so it's really a superfood. So it's packed with vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin K, lots of other things, and notably resveratrol. So if you're interested in supporting cardiovascular health, whenever mulberries are in season, you probably should be eating mulberry fruit, making mulberry preserves, making mulberry pie, and it's a very heart healthy food consume, and they are everywhere. You cannot get away from mulberries. So if you live in a coastal district in Central Florida or throughout South Florida, you're likely to see one of our native figs in the genus Ficus, which, might I add, are closely related to mulberries. They're both in the Moraceae, so they're both in the fig family. So these figs, although they're a lot smaller, they are in the same genus as the figs that you buy at the store or grow in your yard from ornamental trees, albeit just smaller, but they are very, very good and have most of the same health benefits, if not more, than the exotic figs that you buy at the store. So if you do not see Ficus aurea wherever you live, you may see Ficus citrifolia, which is our other native fig. And if you don't have either of those, there's usually some species of Ficus nearby to you producing fruit. So along the roadsides throughout much of the state, a lot of people are surprised to hear that we have what are essentially wild onions. So Alea canadense, var canadense is prevalent, ubiquitous. It's found everywhere. Onion addict. So for me, the fact that these plants are found all over the majority of the state is really exciting. I have often just seen a field of wild onions and just pulled over for a snack because they're damn good. So just something to keep in mind. I've made a point map a lot of these on those maps I talked about earlier because they're just so widespread. So, and it's very easy to identify them. They, in many ways, look just like the onions that you cultivate in your garden. They're in the same genus. So, gopher apple. Right now is the season of gopher apple. A number of people may have known it historically as being in the genus Licania, but it is no longer. It's been moved to the genus Geobalanus. So gopher apple is very closely related to cocoa plum, which grows in the southern half of the state. Although I think most people that forage for gopher apple would argue that it is far superior in taste to cocoa plums, which kind of just they're sweet but have no flavor. These actually taste like cocoa, and they are in the cocoa family, so it would make sense that they taste like cocoa. But roadsides can look like huge monocultural thickets of gopher apple. The bottom right, that lighter green, is just one big giant gopher apple colony. And gopher apples create woody stems underground. Plants in Florida that do that are called geoxyles. So this is a geoxylic plant in that it just forms a big colony on the ground and can produce huge amounts of these fruit in the fall of the year. So this is some that I collected recently, and they didn't last very long. As a matter of fact, they don't last long anywhere that I bring them because they're quite addicting. They taste so good. So, and these are everywhere throughout the region. You really cannot get away from them, especially in scrubby flatwoods, stubs, sandhills, and often in rural places that are quite degraded. You can go and go for persistent. So native violets. Violets usually take high summer off, but then usually by this time right now, and I noticed just a little while ago, are beginning to emerge in mass. So they form lots of basal rosettes. All of the different species across the state do. So anything from Viola lancifolia to Viola sororia, all of the different native violets that grow throughout the state are edible, raw or cooked, are packed with nutrients. And usually, if not always, you can go in and harvest the leaves. You can even harvest the flowers, and the plants will just grow right back. As a matter of fact, across the deep south, violets, if you put one violet in your garden, usually within 2 years, you have so many of them that you're frustrated. So a lot of people rip them out to try to reduce the amount of them they have in their yard. Well, if you need to reduce the amount that you have, keep in mind that you can eat all of them. So a very cool plant, the entire genus. So a lot of people can probably walk outside of their house, look in their gardens, look in the cracks in the sidewalk, look around their air condition vent, and they're going to inevitably see this plant. So this is Hawksbeard. It's in the genus Youngia, and the particular species that we see here growing throughout the state is Youngia japonica. It's exotic, but it can be found virtually everywhere. And what a lot of people don't realize is that this is basically just a wild dwarf lettuce. That's all it is. So whenever you go through and mass pick the leaves from wherever they're growing, you basically you've just collected a mass of lettuce greens. So it's edible, cooked, and it's real good. So I urge you to try out this plant if you have not. It's one of my favorites, especially as a pot herb to mix in a stew, but I also like it in salads. So, and I have this in here just so people understand. Usually when we're talking about plants that we need to stay away from, if they produce white sap, that's an indicator that we need to stay away from them because they're probably toxic. Well, you can suspend that when you're dealing with wild lettuces. Wild lettuces will produce a white to yellowish sap, and that is usually a good indicator because that white sap is full of nutrients that have been bred out of the salads that you buy at the grocery store. And so if you see that on a wild lettuce, that means that it's a wild lettuce as long as you've identified it correctly. So we have many other wild lettuce species, and they're all in the subfamily of asters that are called they're in the chicory subfamily of asters. So that is a colony of Florida lettuce, which is just a wild lettuce. It's in the same genus as cultivated lettuces, so it's in the genus Lactuca. Produces flowers that look very similar to cultivated lettuces. The only difference is that they have these angular science fiction movie looking leaves because these plants are wild and they have not been cultivated to look pretty and to have simple leaves like we see in the grocery store. But they are otherwise just wild lettuces that are ready to pick and go. All right, so blackberries. Blackberries, we know we can eat blackberries. So blackberries are in the genus Rubus, and we have numerous species of blackberry in the genus Rubus. So dewberry, sand blackberry, Pennsylvania blackberry. I could go on and on and on. Keep in mind that there is more to use on a blackberry vine than just the fruit. And so even if it's off season and there are no fruit to be found on the vines, if anyone has had blackberry tea, all that they have had are blackberry leaves that have been picked from a blackberry vine and dried. And so you can use those leaves throughout the year to make a delicious, nutritious blackberry tea. which is very, very good for you. So in addition to the fruit, keep in mind that you can use the leaves for other things. So they're prickly pears. Usually people are accustomed to consuming cacti in the desert Southwest, but in Florida, it seems a little bit more taboo. So we have several native species and a few non-native species, but for the purpose of this PowerPoint, we're talking about species in the genus Opuntia. And so usually on a cacti, on a cactus species in the genus Opuntia, better known as the prickly pears, we have the fruit component, which you can eat, and then we have the pads, which are botanically known as cladodes. And you can eat both of these. And so whenever you cut the fruit, this is what it looks like. It's very sweet, usually very juicy. And so the juices and the tannins that are in the fruit can impart very reddish, pinkish flavor, color plus flavor to whatever you add it to. If you add it to your oatmeal or to some confectioner or to a salad, don't be surprised if it turns the oatmeal the same color as the fruit itself. But the fruit is very good, and it's also awesome to make margaritas and cocktails that are infused with prickly pear fruit. So very cool to use that when you see that. So the fruit again is edible and very good, and so are the pads. The pads are usually better if you cook them and process them. You can also cut them up and put them in your salads. The old-timey way of removing the spines, better known as the glaucids, those little tiny spines that are on the cacti, was to take a fire and to burn them off. These days, some restaurants will do that, which is pretty cool. But generally, if you want to remove the glaucid spines from a prickly pear, you just take some roll tape and you can roll it across the fruit and the pad to remove them, or you can just cut them off with a knife. Either way, I certainly hope you don't allow those spines to deter you from nibbling on some fruit or collecting a pad or two. Okay, sorry that faded in like that. So we don't have wild strawberries per se here in Florida, but we do have a sister genus known as the Indian strawberry in the genus Potentilla. It is quite widespread across the state and often not seen or vouchered in a lot of places simply because no one looks down and sees it. These colonies can be huge. There can be hundreds and hundreds of fruit on the ground. And because the plant grows so low to the ground, you may not even notice that it's there. So whenever you're out somewhere, look down and you very well may see this. And it's an edible fruit, and it's essentially a strawberry. So also out there across the state, you're very likely to see this plant popping up all over the place. And so this is Spiderwort. It's in the genus Tradescantia. And in Florida, we have several species native. The species that's pictured here is by far the most widespread. So this is Ohio spiderwort. So this is Tradescantia ohioensis. It can be frustratingly common in the state where people don't even realize it's native because it seems to be so weedy. And so every component of this plant is edible, raw or cooked. It has a lot of different applications culinarily. A lot of people in the modern context don't call it spiderwort anymore. And for those of you that may not be familiar with why the word wart is used with a lot of plants, it's because it's Old English for weed. Wart was the word that was used in the ancient world for weed. But these days, a lot of people don't call it spiderwort, they call it radiation plant. And the reason why they call it radiation plant is because the little fine that are going around stamens where the pollen are, if this is in an area that is subjected to dangerous levels of radiation, it will turn pink. And so this cool native wildflower that's widespread, edible, and delicious, and important for bees, also acts as a natural indicator of dangerous conditions for people and wildlife to surface because of radioactive fallout. This plant has been used overseas and in other places, such as Chernobyl, and the stamens turn pink. The stamen hairs turn pink whenever they're subjected to radiation. There can also be an indicator of pollutants in the ground if the stamens turn pink. So anyways, an amazing plant with a gazillion different applications. So aside from nutrients, it's also a mucilage. So it's a plant, and by that what I mean is it's a thickener. So if you collect the leaves and stems of spiderwort, you can add this to a stew or to something else, and it will act as a thickener, just like a stew thickener that you might purchase in the store. So a fantastic plant, and I definitely encourage you to try out spiderwort. So the wood sorrels, there's scarcely, our state does not have wood sorrels. So this is Oxalis debilis, the exotic pink wood sorrel. This is the Oxalis corniculata, the native people learn plant forage walk are so captive by the flavor of this plant that I normally have to slow people down from eating too much. There's oxalic acid in it. And whenever you eat it, it has this really little burst of tartness to it. So these are widespread, and if you collect all of the vegetation, it very likely to grow back. So here's an exotic one growing. So everywhere, ubiquitous. I encourage you to try this plant. So a lot of roadsides and horse pasture yards throughout the state will have this plant growing. So usually you notice it because you see those inflorescences, you see those seed stalks coming up from the ground. If you look closer, you'll see that it has a hastate or sword dagger shaped leaf, which is an indicator that you are looking at Rumex acetula, better known as sheep sorrel. Sheep sorrel is a wild green. It's a native plant that grows all over the state from north to south and is delicious. It goes well in salads. It goes well in stews. I can't say enough about it. Pawpaws, we have numerous species and subspecies and hybrids found across the state of pawpaw. Pawpaw is North America's largest native fruit. And even now, researchers go out across the country looking for individual pawpaws that are producing that next new delicious thing. Tastiest fruit. Pawpaw with the longest shelf life. People want this native plant cultivated. There's a demand for it. So I guess we lost connection. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It did not tell me that it dropped, so I'm not even sure what people saw or did not see. But I'll go ahead and just keep going here.
It was breaking up around wood sorrel, but we heard a lot of the pawpaws as well. So if you want to keep going, I think that's good.
Thank you. it won't let me scroll through the slideshow. Sorry about that. I'll get it right here. Okay, let's go on and see if I can get it to work from here. Okay, I think it's working. Let me compensate for the lost time. Let me go ahead here. Let me see here. Okay, let's just pick up right here. All right, so holly species. This is American holly in this photograph. Holly species, we have a number of holly species around the state. Dahoon holly is very common around the peninsula, and gallberry is virtually found everywhere. And with all holly species here and across the world, you can make a really good tea from the leaves. But for the purpose of this PowerPoint, we're going to focus on one of these species. We're going to focus on Yaupon holly. Yaupon holly is planted as a landscaping shrub, bush, or tree, and it is also very, very widespread and common across the state. It is called Ilex vomitoria, and the reason why they named it Ilex vomitoria is because when settlers first arrived, they noticed that Native Americans would drink this and they seemed to become sick afterwards, and so they thought that it was a purgative drink. But we now know that we were incorrect and that Native Americans were using it for various reasons, including as a hazing drink. And so the plant was used to make you feel good and to give you energy. And it was also a rite of passage to see which person could down the most Yaupon holly tea that was variably known in dialects as black drink. And so the reason why it made them feel good is because Yaupon holly has more caffeine in it than any other native plant in North America. It is closely related to yerba mate, which is the South American equivalent of it, but it is a native tea that is caffeinated. And years ago, this PowerPoint had slides in it that talked about how this is a budding industry. And since then, a number of people have started businesses where they sell Yaupon holly online. And so it's really great to see this native plant working to support people financially. I don't have enough to say about it. Just keep in mind that it was used by everyone, including the Seminole. The name Osceola translates as black drink dancer, black drink shouter, and a number of other interpretations. So everyone used it, everyone loved it. It's delicious. Frog fruit, Phylla nodiflora. It's this dwarf little plant that's in the Verbenaceae. It's found across the state, and this plant has actually been introduced around the world. It is subject to a huge amount of research because it is a powerhouse. In addition to edibility, research has demonstrated, and I'll say this fun and fast, anti-acne, antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal, anti-tumor, anti-inflammatory, anti-diuretic, and it's expectorant, and it is a vermifuge. So lucky for us, it's a vermifuge in that if we have intestinal worms, if we ingest it. So who would have thought this underneath our feet would be so good for us, and is at the same time a larval host for the Phaon crescent butterfly, upon which it depends. So usually when I'm in a room with people and they see this plant, I kind of hear some shuddering in the audience, and it's because I don't think a lot of people realize the ecological importance and/or the health benefits of this native wildflower. So most people see Bidens alba or Bidens pilosa, which is the white flowering species, but we also have other species like Bidens mitis, Bidens levis, and Bidens bipinnata. We have numerous species of Bidens that are all collectively known as Spanish needles, this plant is incredible. So in addition to being a major source of pollen for the honey industry here in Florida, and in addition to being a very ecologically important flower for pollinators, This is also a plant that's good for people. So you can eat it raw. It may be too strong for some people raw. So you can parboil it. You can mix it in and make a dip out of it. I know people that make tea from it. I also know people that smoke the fresh leaves because it has phytosterone in it. Phytosterone is a compound that works to sort of open up your blood vessels. It's a vascular dilator, and so it helps to relax you. So a lot of people consume it when they want to relax, or if they take it as a sleepy time tea or a sleepy time food. So it's an amazing plant, so I encourage you to leave a little bit of it in a corner of your backyard. Carolina pony's foot, and I think because of time, I'll go ahead and stop right here to leave time for questions after I talk about Carolina pony's foot. But Carolina pony's foot is a dwarf plant that is often found in our yards, found in the woods, found on the side of the road. It's very small. The leaves are kidney-shaped. It's in the genus Dichondra. And this plant is edible, raw or cooked right off of the ground. You can scarcely go somewhere in the state of Florida and not find this plant. So as a Boy Scout, this was a plant that I recall learning about in that it was just readily available as a trailside nibble. But now I use it mixed in with other with salads with other greens. So I'm going to go ahead for the sake of time and questions. And might I add that if anyone that's on this wants this PowerPoint, we can make this PowerPoint available to you if you want to review the slides that I have not had time to go over tonight. But what I will do is go ahead and I'm going to leave with this screen right here, if I can get it on here. I'm going to assume everyone can see that. Here are some really good websites to learn about these species and learn about some of the things that I've said tonight. That's my email address at the top. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and stop talking to see if we have some questions.
Thank you, Scott. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Just a little easier than having anyone talk. There's some from the beginning. Jackie Raleigh said she needs the address of Central Florida map, and good to see and hear from you again.
Hi, Jackie. It's been a while.
Do you have, I guess if you make the PowerPoint available, we'll have the Central Florida map.
Yes, the Central Florida map, whenever I hang up, whenever we're done, I can email you, or I can email whoever wants it, the hyperlink that goes to the map, and then it'll be available for them to look at on their Google Maps forever. Is that okay?
That sounds good. Yeah, if you want to send it to me, I can post it on our Facebook, or yeah, everyone saw his email as well if you want to personally request it.
I'll send it to you either way.
Okay. Johanna said, I think in response to the beginning about learning about ethnobotany, or if you want to create a connection with the land and learn from the way our ancestors interacted with the land, that and food sovereignty. I'm not going to say this word for some reason. Sovereignty?
Sovereignty, I guess.
Sovereignty, yeah. Are good ethical reasons. For
yes,
foraging.
that's a super ethically righteous reason to do that. If you, you know, a lot of these plants co-evolved with fire and wildlife. And so, for example, I spoke about Yaupon holly earlier. Yaupon holly can be frustrating how dense it is in some places, and it's dense because of fire suppression. And so often when you go in and harvest a bunch of Yaupon holly, you have conducted the mechanical equivalent of a prescribed burn on it. And so the plant just grows right back. And so these are very sustainable resources, especially if it's a pyrogenic species like that. So ethics is underneath all of this. So I appreciate that.
Amanda Martin asked, which edible herbs do you find most popular with people?
So oxalis, the wood sorrels, are very high on that list. And aside from wood sorrel, rattlesnake root, Florida Betony, it's in the genus Stachys floridana, is a very, very popular one with people because it makes these giant tuberous edible roots that are delicious in stir fry. And other places around the world grow them as a commercial crop. There are some niche markets that get $70 a pound for this wild weed found throughout the state. So other than that, I would probably have to say that glasswort that grows at the coast in the genus Sarcocornea. So Sarcocornea ambigua. If you go out with a group of people, especially children, and you introduce them to glassworts, they cannot stop eating it. It's super addicting because there's salt in it and it's crunchy. And it's also being grown elsewhere as a source of vegetable oil because all that it is a super little halophile dwarfed amaranth. So it's very closely related to, relatively speaking, to quinoa. Other than that, the most popular plant that I have brought samples of to presentations above and beyond any other plant is kudzu. So it's a category 1 invasive, but if you pick the leaves and you can fry them in, acorn oil, avocado oil, olive oil, whatever you want, you can lightly bread them if you want, but they taste just like popcorn. And they are so addicting that research has shown that when drug and alcohol prone people consume kudzu, they begin to prefer to eat the kudzu over whatever the underlying problem is. So I bring a bowl and I get none. That's generally how it works. So who would have thought? But then you run into an ethical issue there because then you're talking about making a commodity out of a category 1 invasive. So there's a fine line there.
Awesome. Mandy Morgan said, do you typically make the blackberry tea with fresh leaves or dry? And you said the fresh biden leaves for tobacco substitute or dry. For
blackberry, I will use just air-dried blackberry leaves. Usually it imparts a bitter flavor if you use fresh leaves that have not dried out. If you have a dehydrator, you can, do it quickly, or you can just sit them somewhere in the sunlight and let them dry. But dried blackberry leaves, and also the same with bidens. The leaves should be dried if you're going to use them as a smoke substitute. If you're going to use them for food, then you should, eat them raw or cooked. Bidens for tea is best if it's dried.
This might be something for later, but Nathan says that the FloridaEdibleLandscaping.com is coming up with the Air 404.
An Air okay.
The website isn't working.
Uh-oh. I will check on that, and whenever I email you with the map website, I will give you an update on that.
Anne asked if, is roadside exhaust from cars a problem for roadside gathering?
The majority of plants that you are likely to harvest from the side of the road are going to be from the back slope of the road. I would never encourage anyone to harvest material from the soil that's directly adjacent to the concrete or down in the ditch. I will say that with the caveat that experienced foragers are relatively aware of which species bioaccumulate toxins and which ones don't, which is something you learn with time. And in that context, yeah, you tend to harvest more. But if you're new to this, most of the herbaceous species that grow on the side of the road, if you harvest them from the back slope, Most of them are relatively safe. Of course, you want to wipe them off. You want to wash them down. But the majority of the species that grow on the side of the road do not bioaccumulate concerning things on that back slope. So that is a niche of foraging that requires more discussion beyond the scope of this PowerPoint. And usually it's on a species by species basis. So because, for example, there are some roadside species that are used in bioremediation because they uptake lots of heavy metals and chemicals. So like alligator weed, plants that are in the genus Alternanthera, they bioaccumulate bad things and take them out of the landscape. But if there are no bad things in the landscape, it's one of the tastiest things you can find around growing in the wild. So hope that answers your question. If you have questions about specific roadside plants, please just reach out to me.
Awesome. Anne asked what the best reference book is.
Well, there are lots of reference books out there that are available. I have said this for years. There really is not a good reference that captures a lot of the species that are common throughout the state of Florida. And to that end, it has been an ongoing demand that a book needs to be made that focuses on a lot of these.
Write that.
Yeah. So I probably need to quit my other jobs and stuff, and I could do it. But it needs to happen. So online websites, like I see, I should probably, so Plants for a Future, pfaf.org, that's a pretty good one. But as far as books are concerned, a lot of books don't cover a lot of the species that we're likely to see in and around the region. I wish I had a better answer, but many of the species that I talk about and show people on forage walks, there's not a lot of adequate literature in the form of a book that covers that here in this region. A lot of stuff up north, but the coastal plain is neglected when it comes to field guides for edibles, I'm afraid. So let's talk about that more. We'll get it going.
Amanda Martin asked, is there an edible component for the Florida air potato, or is it just kudzu?
Kudzu. Air potato is generally not able to be used for much of anything, I guess, unless you're a air potato bug. So you could probably boil it in 30 changes of water and get something out of it, but even then I wouldn't recommend that with air potato.
Mandy Morgan asked, what was the species of rumex with the interesting leaf shape that you spoke about?
That's Rumex hestatula, which is probably the most widespread rumex throughout the state. And behind that, the most common rumex you're likely to see is Rumex verticillata, the swamp dock. Swamp dock does not have those hastate leaves. It's also edible, but usually you have to, you end up boiling the leaves of that species because they tend to be bitter without boiling. Rumex hestatula, they're edible, delicious right off the plant in the field.
Johanna asked, any notes on plants with relationships beyond just being used as food? For instance, indigenous use and ceremony or spiritual uses?
Yes, there's a lot of that is just captured in anthropological literature, and the role of modern ethnobotanists has often been to take that and work to objectively demonstrate it in a laboratory. And I don't know if I'm going in the direction of answering her question or not. But for example, American beautyberry, it was widely known and yet informally known that in the Deep South, a lot of folks would go and collect the leaves of beautyberry and they would stuff them in the collars of their shirt. I'm not gonna lie, I've been stuffing beautyberry in the collars of my shirt while I'm here. Because when you stuff it in your shirt, the mosquitoes seem to stay away from that area. So ethnobotanists went out and demonstrated that native peoples and also early settlers had it right. There is in fact a compound in it known as calicarpanol that is very effective at deterring mosquitoes from biting you. And so a lot of research and a lot of what we know about these plants is actually based in old knowledge. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if you're actually looking for databases. And a lot of my research has been just researching scholarly articles per species for these, because it's not necessarily organized in the best way. There are a few really big books. So hope that answers your question.
All right, that's all the questions that I see in here right now. Does anyone else have any questions they want to add to the chat? I'm gonna say that's it. You got a bunch of thank yous in the chat as well. I did skip over those, but
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. This was great.
Okay, I'll send you the link to that map in a moment.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.